I appreciate your attention and thank you ahead of time for your engagement and questions. Before I ask my colleagues and panelists to introduce themselves, I want to set some ground rules for our experience with each other. We don't want this to be uh, a, an experience where we do all the talking and you take furious notes and then hold us accountable to them later on. That we want this to be a shared learning experience. So as something strikes a question or you want clarification, please interrupt and engage, and let's have a dialogue with each other, not a traditional panel presentation that you listen to. We want this to be a shared experience. I'm Russell Lowry Hart. I'm president of Amarillo College and honored to work with my colleagues. And before I ask them to introduce themselves, I've got to give a shout out to my friend Terry Crawford, who is welcome to come join us at any moment, Terry. So just appreciate your willingness to share with us, and particularly appreciate you, Terry, for organizing us, and looking forward to learning from all three of you today.
Thank you. I'm Pam Anglin, president of Paris Junior College, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Justin Lunnan, Chancellor of Dallas College.
I'm Terry Zamora. I'm the Vice Chancellor of Fiscal Affairs at San Jacinto College.
So before we start, tell us about each one of your professional backgrounds just briefly, because like some are accountants, some are communication professors by training, and didn't come to business and budgets in the same pathway.
Some are very knowledgeable, and then there's Russell and I.
Right?
So my background is finance and accounting. Came out of college with a bachelor's in finance and a master's with concentration in accounting. Worked in business and industry for a while before I got over into education, and actually was a financial officer at a university, and then decided I wanted to teach accounting at a community college where I knew I could make a difference. And from that became a chief financial officer and then a president.
And that's why you're here.
Yep. And I'm a CPA.
Okay, I didn't know that part. I'm going to call you later. We have our audit meeting on Tuesday. I'll get some advice. Terry?
Sure. I also majored in accounting, have a BBA in accounting and a master's in accounting, and actually spent about 20 years in private industry, including about half of that across the border in the Mexican maquiladora industry, so that gives me quite a different perspective. When people ask me how do I stay calm when horrible things happen, I go work in Mexico for 10 years and everything on this side of the border will seem calm. About 20 years into my career, I made a switch into higher ed, and it was basically because I lived in a relatively small town and I needed a job. It wasn't a very theoretical switch, but oh man, that first year I realized that for the first time in my life I was doing something besides trying to make money, and so I was hooked. And so now 20 years later, I've worked at several different colleges, always in the CFO role, and I've enjoyed it very much.
Justin?
So I am none of the things that you just heard. My background is I started as the press secretary for the mayor of Dallas, and I didn't have a background in journalism. My education has been more on the political science side of things, public administration side of things, and started at Dallas City Hall as an intern. And that internship then turned into the opportunity to be press secretary, and so spent time on the political side of things, and that transitioned into the governmental relations, legislative affairs, and so when I first came to Dallas College 17 years ago, I came to the college to lead our governmental relations efforts in Austin and in DC. And honestly, when I came to the college, I just thought, hey, I'll polish up my education creds and in the GR space, and then go back to the private sector and make a cajillion dollars. But what happened is I fell in love with the work that goes on in the community college and the impact that we all have in our communities. And so that's what excites me about getting up every day to do the work that we all do.
So our panel is statutorily required. I feel like I finally have arrived as a professional. And I think our charge is to help our elected officials just understand their role in leading a budgeting process. So the things that we want to talk about today are, and I appreciate Terry's frame for this, the things that we have in our control. We're going to talk about revenue. We're going to talk about expenses. We're going to talk about our processes and hope that you'll engage in sharing yours. Then we're going to talk about return on investment, and then how do we actually plan for the future in a sector where planning anything around budgets is perilous and puts all of our jobs at risk. So let's start by talking about the things that we can control. And I'll ask Terry to kind of give us a framework, and then we'll dialogue with each other about what that looks like.
So what you don't see on the screen is what we can't control, and probably that's the larger list. Pandemics, economy, what the legislature's going to do next time they meet, and those types of things. Our taxpayers' ability to pay their taxes. So those are things we always have to deal with. But what we try to concentrate on is what we can control. And there's just some things I think we all agree to remain true to our mission, to work together to some extent within different colleges, do that in different ways. Prioritizing competing items. I know at our college we have this massive list of things that people think are urgently needed, and that at some point, some level of people have to sit down and prioritize to say, what can we really afford? To focus on financial sustainability and resilience. We've really been keying on that the last few years, because the view is no matter what happens in the outside world, in 10 years we'd like to still be here serving our community. And if we don't make some smart decisions now, we can't do that. And then to test good ideas. Don't think you have to put everything out there for every student the first time, but likewise, don't think you just test something and keep it small. Test ideas, you'll fail at some will be exceedingly beneficial for students, and scale those up. And that helps prioritize that thing the next time around. And so those are just some of the things we know we can control.
So when I've spent a lot of my career in the university sector, and what I've loved the most about being in the community college sector is that it is the most collaborative. We share best practices, we share our biggest mistakes. But one of the things that I experienced as a new president is that we were at a conference like this and hearing what other schools were doing, and my regents came home and was like, well, we want to do that. But the thing that is in our control is also the things that control us, local context. What are your local contexts that are in your control, and why does Justin's board have a different conversation about those things than your board?
So Harris Junior College is considered a medium college. So we're grouped in small, medium, large, and extra large.
Yeah.
So we are a medium college, and so we don't have a big staff, and we don't have a lot of money. So the way we work is probably quite a bit different than the other panelists. The trustees or regents are responsible for setting tuition. They're responsible for setting the tax rate. They're responsible for selecting the depository and selecting the independent auditor. So for us in controlling tuition rates, and we have to look very closely at what the surrounding community colleges charge. And we also have to always keep in mind that for every dollar we increase tuition, we're probably locking somebody out of ever going to college. And so our board has been very conscious of that over the years, and we actually have had a goal of keeping our tuition below the state average. And we also have a small tax base. Our tax base is just over $5 billion. We serve 5.5 counties, but our taxing district is only Lamar County. And so about 70% of our enrollment is out of district. And so setting that tax rate, our tax rate, we don't have a lot of flexibility with the laws that are in place, so it gives the board very little flexibility in setting a tax rate, because we want to stay under the voter approval rate, and between that and the no new revenue rate, there's not even a penny difference. So there's not a real big decision there every year for us. But those are the things that we do have control over, but then our surroundings
Or things
set the
that have control of
parameters.
you, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so Pam's context is quite different than your context.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are similarities, but the scope and scale is different. And certainly the tax base aspect is very different. In Dallas County, we have a large tax base which to draw from. And so, as a Dallas County resident, we'll account for a little less than 5% of your tax bill. But what we can do with those resources, with the magnitude, given the large tax base, means that we can do things because we have resources. We don't always have to do things to get resources. And so, oftentimes we're starting the conversation with members of our team. There's several here in the room, and one of our trustees that's here with us, that I tend to say, let's not let current reality stand in the way of a good idea. Let's try to figure out, if it makes sense, then let's try to figure out how we can make the financial side of it work. But there are differences, certainly, with what Dr. Anglin just described, with the Paris service area and taxing jurisdiction that don't line up versus in Dallas County, where those do line up. And so all of our taxpayers and our service area, we're all locked in together. So we're all in together in investing and making those decisions together. And so when you get down to individual considerations and policy items, a big one here in the state has been around dual credit. We approach that very differently. And the revenue mix is very different. So, Pam, your the percentage of your revenue mix that is tax base versus state versus tuition is very different than ours. And so because of the large tax base that we can depend on, we can keep our tuition very low, and we're less dependent on the state portion of the revenue mix.
So you brought up revenue. Terry, I'm going to ask you to give us a frame for revenue. And while you're doing that, I want each of you to tell us what your biggest barrier to revenue generation is at each of your institutions.
Okay, so as we approach each year, the first thing that my team is going to do before we even engage the rest of college on the budget exercise is sit down and look at what we think realistically is appropriate or was within our grasp for revenues. And of course, tuition is one thing we look at. Different colleges take different approaches. In our college in fall of 19, which was the beginning of fiscal year 20, we went to a flat revenue, meaning everything's in tuition, there's no fees. We did that for simplicity. We did it for the students' benefit of knowing what their bill was going to be before they got to the point of paying. And we did it for equitable access to different programs. Our thought was society needs nurses as much as they need English majors, and so we should make an equitable path to all programs. And so that was just the take we had on it. And at the time, we set it a little bit so that between the fees we were giving up and the tuition we were putting in and rolling it all in tuition, it was a slight increase. And our thought was we would wait 3 years and then we would look at increasing tuition. But the pandemic hit right after that, and so as a result, This would have been the year, and we passed on that opportunity this year, so we'll be looking at it next year. But I think that's probably the biggest question each college needs to look at each year is, are we going to change anything about our self-generated enrollment income, whether it's through tuition or fees? And then, are you going to budget for an increase in enrollment? Because that's the other way to increase tuition and fees. And that's been somewhat difficult to even get our arms around the last few years. And then staying within allowable tax rates, as Pam mentioned, the last thing we want to do is trigger an election. We also don't want to be perceived as just running up to the highest six digits of a percent that we can without an election. So somewhere between the voter approval rate and the no new revenue rate is where we go. In my case, we're in a growing tax base. We have a lot of industry. I think a lot of the taxing districts are more residential. Ours is more industrial driven. So it tends to rise more, but it's also more sensitive to the economy. So it's kind of a mixed blessing sometimes. But everyone has to consider what's their reality on the tax base side. And then the state funding level. If I look historically, the last 10 years for our college, it's been almost the exact same dollar amount every year. Yay. But guess what? There's been a little inflation, and it's become a less and less part of our overall revenue mix. And I know you mentioned y'all's two mixes are very different. And I believe about 8 or 10 years ago, state revenues were about 35% of our unrestricted revenue, and today they're about 20%. And so I'm very hopeful with the work of the Finance Commission, and that's all the thing
Yeah.
we're looking forward to, but still somewhat of an unknown, that will be corrected, and so that you'll know what you're shooting at, and it'll be equitable as far as if you hit certain markers, you'll know what you're going to benefit from that. And I think that'll be a big increase, a big benefit for us.
I think that's the biggest shift
Yeah.
in all of our realities is that state makes up about 20% of our revenue, when 20 years ago it was 65 to 70% of our revenue. And that's the part that the public doesn't understand. They think that higher ed's funding, we have out of control spending, and I can tell you, working at a community college, I didn't understand poor until I worked at a community college. So tell us about kind of how you all create revenue and what your biggest barrier to increasing revenue might be.
We don't have a lot of flexibility, so our tax rate ends up being about 12% of our total revenue generation. State appropriations have been in about 35%. The rest of it we make up in tuition and fee revenue. What we have to do when we're starting a new program, for example, I have to determine what's that startup cost going to be, and we look at all the numbers on it, and I look at all the equipment cost, and then I'm out finding foundations that are going to help us, donors that are going to help us to fund that. And we've been very fortunate on that. But we have to look at everything very, very carefully. Typically, if we're going to put something in new, we have to give up something. So we're looking at how well everything is doing, what kind of benefit we're looking at data on everything and making our decisions on where our limited resources go.
Well, and Justin, you have all the money in the world, so you don't have a problem with revenue, right?
You said it. Yeah. Well, like I said earlier, it is certainly a different consideration when, the tax base is in the hundreds of billions. And so, yeah, again, for us, we deal with some of the same institutional things to make sure that we're looking at the data, we're paying attention, that we're not just fat, dumb, and happy, and that we really are trying to be as efficient as we can. And I can tell you that wasn't always the case. We as an institution have gone through a consolidation, and that I don't necessarily recommend those of you clamoring to do that. But there are efficiencies that are certainly garnered through that we were able to take that and redeploy those resources in new ways directly in this, primarily in the student services side. But to try to get creative with the revenue aspect, certainly the philanthropic community in Dallas is very generous. We have a great team that is able to get creative with grants and additional dollars. But you know, we all have a responsibility to our taxpayers and those that we serve, and so we work very hard to try to figure out how to leverage those dollars with private dollars and grant dollars as well.
I want to add too that we've been very fortunate because Dallas College has invited us to partner with them on several grants and opportunities to where it's really brought some amazing things to our communities because we've been able to be in a consortium with Dallas.
Yeah, I mean, we can all learn a lot from each other.
Terry, what are the biggest barriers to revenue and generation in your community?
I would have to say a real sensitivity to the financial situations of our students.
Yeah.
And a real hesitation to charge anything that we absolutely don't have to. We are a Hispanic serving institution, and we have high poverty in our area. We also have wealth, but we also have high poverty, and it's predominant in the students typically that come to community colleges. And so anything that we can do without, we would rather do without, so we don't have to charge them for it.
I'm sure you all have done the same analysis, and it might be analysis that when you go back home, you ask for your leadership to. But at Amarillo College, we have historicals for every dollar that we've increased tuition, the subsequent enrollment decrease. And so you're always in this balance of trying to generate revenue for raises, but when you're in a population center like ours that isn't growing, those are really difficult conversations. How do you manage that conversation within your institution?
With faculty and staff, every meeting we have as a group, it is, you are all responsible for enrollment. We are all recruiters. Everyone that works here is a recruiter. Everywhere you go, you need to talk to people. So that's kind of, it's a kind of a, come on, let's go get them, the team, everybody's got to get in there and play, and making everybody try to realize that it's all of our responsibilities for enrollment. And even though we've been there 100 years, there's still a lot of people in our community that really don't realize what all we do. And there are young people that still don't know that they can go to college.
Yeah.
And so we're out there having to try to get the message out that, and we say, and I say, you tell them, if they want to go to college, we'll help them find a way.
So those are conversations that determine our very survivability. For each of your institutions, maybe a different experience where enrollment concerns may not drive every one of your faculty meetings like they do for Pam and I, but you're still really good stewards of your finances. How do you strike that balance within your institutions?
Well, I mean, first of all, as Dr. England said, you know, our students are all price sensitive. So every little shift in tuition makes a tremendous difference. So we are always intently looking to see what can we do to support our students' journey, to ensure that they know that this opportunity does exist for them. I talk about that we're in the barrier busting business, focusing on those barriers that get in the way of student success to and through and beyond our doors. Because all of our institutions offer an amazing instructional product in the classroom at a high quality that's affordable, but it's those life issues that get in the way. And you know, Russell and his team do as great a job as anybody in the state of focusing on those barriers, and are national leaders in this space. So enrollment is always going to be important. and it's important for different reasons, and some that we've articulated. But ultimately, it's about the opportunity that someone is missing out on if they're not taking advantage of what we can provide them and how we can help change their lives. So our team is certainly very focused on enrollment, but increasingly, all of us are going to be focused on the outcomes and what's happening to students while we're there. With Dallas being, we're in such a large market that historically we could lose a large percentage of students year over year, but there's a whole new crop that comes in and our enrollment would continue to go up. But what disservice did we do to that group of students that we lost and didn't get to finish what they were there for?
So one of the things that we were actually talking about this at lunch, but one of the things that we were able to do, I think, throughout COVID was obviously we had a new source of revenue to help us address things that some presented as new things and some are things we had always wanted to address. And so our mission now is to determine what were the best things that we were able to do with some of the federal money and how can we continue it? What do we need to do? Where do the resources come from? One thing that we did that I think is what we got the award for was what we call Fast Track, and it basically lets students come free for anything they complete within 12 months, non-credit or credit. Okay, that's a great program. Right now we're trying to gather data on what happened next. What did they do next? Did they get the credential? Did they get the job? So that's the first step. And then the second step is, okay, it's proven. How do we fund it in the future? And is that grants? Is that giving up something else? I mentioned I'd worked at several different higher education institutions, and we're all great at adding things. We're collectively not
Terrible
very
at
good at letting
taking
things
away
go.
things.
And so that's part of the exercise.
I think what's interesting about something you just referenced is that we've all had an influx in revenue with CARES funds with ill-defined strings attached to it. So I think we were all very conservative in how we leveraged it. And I was, in talking with you all and some of our colleagues, surprised that collectively we were reticent to use those resources to add some new. So this one I'm going to ask you all to engage in the conversation. How did your institutions use that new revenue for impact in your communities?
So we provided, pretty much if the students came up to 12 hours of courses, we covered that tuition. And that went a long way. But surprisingly, what you just said made me start thinking about that, and that is that our enrollment didn't change any numbers. In fact, it kept going down. And so I'm not sure what to make of that. And the fact that, when you raise tuition, you said you maybe reducing access to students, but then
You gave tuition for free and reduced access, yeah.
I didn't see any movement.
Isn't that the hardest part of this whole experience in the last 3 years is the unpredictability of what it means? I think we're going to be studying that for decades. Other use of CARES funds that's influenced your community?
I think the best thing we did was pay off old little bitty
Yeah.
balances.
Yeah.
that students have.
Yeah.
That's a barrier that can carry along forever. So we eliminated those, and I think that was one of the smartest things that we did.
Yeah, we got a significant number of students who were able to return, but unfortunately did not make up for the loss.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it did allow, even if it was not an opportunity that they will take advantage of today, they could take advantage of it next semester, next year, because the balance the barrier is gone.
So, and Alamo College is going to highlight my good vice chancellor here, because a project he'd been working on, which was books on day one of classes, we were able to start that
Well, we've had an influx in revenue that is here and now is disappearing. So let's talk about what happens after the fact, like after we've spent that money and talked about how we generate new revenue. We've got to talk about how we spend it. So Terry, give us a framework for expenses.
Just a simple framework. Each of us have the things that we're committed to. And at our college, we're committed to an annual salary increase. And the one exception of that was in 2021. We did not give one, but then did follow up with a stipend to everyone the following March. But I think everyone has their own version of what that looks like or doesn't look like. Being in an urban area where people can easily find other jobs, we do it partly to be kind to the employees, and partly it's a retention, and partly it's an attraction. So there's definitely a business case for doing so, particularly with the inflation that people are experiencing right now. We had been in the middle of building out some GO bond finance projects, and so obviously once the building's done, you've got to open it, you've got to operationalize it. It usually requires new staff. Your electric bill just went up, so operationalizing those things is always high on the list and a must-do. There's meaningful strategic initiatives. I mentioned earlier that people bring their needs and their wants and their desires for their departments to the table, and as a group, then our cabinet level team will meet, usually in early June, late May, and just prioritize and see which things line up with our strategic initiatives and which things don't. And those are often hard choices. And then finally, and this probably should have been at the top, operational compliance necessities. Guess what? Our electric rates went up 25%. That's kind of at the top of the list. And then both the federal government and the state government often pass what we affectionately call unfunded mandates, and so they're at the top of the list. And those can look like legal things, or they can look like you must have more counselors for Title IX, or whatever they look like. They could be in the forms of expenditures, safety things in buildings, or they can be headcount. And so those are the main things that we're usually trying to work into our budget. What we like to work in is the meaningful strategic initiatives, but obviously most of the time the other things come first.
So we've all experienced something that I think is historic, and I hope we never experience it again, where we've had, some of us have had enrollment decreases, and with inflation have had real pressures to increase our salaries and compensation. So I want my colleagues to talk about how they've addressed that, and then I want you to be able to share how your institutions have addressed remaining competitive in an environment where enrollment is uncertain, and how are we going to maintain these increases that we've all had to engage.
Well, it is always a balance, ensuring that we can support our employees. And so for us, over this past year, we made some additional investment in our employees that we had at levels we had not previously. We used some of our fund balance as a one-time stipend last fiscal year, as we saw what inflation was doing, and then certainly considered a larger percentage raise this year than we had in the past. And so that did mean that there's some things that fell off the priority list. And some of those were around some considerations and investments that we were making on some facilities operations and considerations. Ultimately, we were talking about leasing some new space that I decided that we weren't going to do at that point, that we wanted to invest in our employees and some of our other priorities around that. And then I'll go back just quickly to the other part about the federal dollars around COVID and what do we do without those. And I think we all learned a lot about our students through all of this. And so things like, we were feeling pretty good about that for $79 a credit hour, our students, get a free public transportation pass because we know transportation is a barrier for many of our students. And during the pandemic, we did a lot of emergency aid for students, as many of us did. And we did, about $5 million, Piper, in emergency aid for transportation alone. So here we were going, wait, we've already covered transportation. It's right there in your tuition. But yet, if any of us bust a fan belt in our car today, we're going to go get that fixed and go about our life. But for our students, it's the cascade effect of can't get to class, can't get to work, can't get my kid to childcare. And so they needed that emergency aid. And so I think those are the considerations that we have to figure out on an ongoing basis, is that need exists, and that need is more obvious and identifiable to us now, but there's not the federal dollars to support that need.
So how did you all, your institutions, manage to increase compensation if you were able to do that? All of a sudden, everyone started looking down.
Yeah.
So, raise, what were your raise rates percentage-wise? Say it louder. 3%. 3%?
We hadn't given any raise.
I have 3%. Do I hear a 4%?
We did 5 at ACC.
Yeah.
It did require us to tighten our budgets a little bit in terms of bird maintenance and things of that sort, but we know the cost of living in Austin is getting increasingly challenging. We want to be mindful of the dynamics. We actually increased minimum wage, so we now no longer have employees making less than $15 an hour. They're making $20 an hour, which was a big bump, and even the quality of life study says that somebody in Austin needs to make $22 an hour. So it's not perfect, but we're getting there. In fact, we were the first municipality in Austin, or Central Texas, to go to 20. And then we raised the minimum wage, or I guess compensation, 5% or 5,000, whichever was greater. But it required a lot of tightening as well.
So we're all gonna get hired by Austin but live in Amarillo,
Yeah.
High flex options.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Say again? We did. We increased minimum wage to 15 and did what a lot of schools did with CARES funds, like using the one-time payments
The
that Justin
stipend.
talked about. I know a lot of us were reticent to make the percent increase 5, 6, 7% where it needed to be because enrollment's so uncertain.
We did the one-time stipends with our HERF money, but we also did salary increases in this year's budget because we saw things in the pandemic that we had not seen before, and
Yeah.
we lost. We had a mass retirement, people that had been there for years that were in a position to retire, and they left during the pandemic and left holes. We lost a lot of historical and institutional knowledge because of that. So we felt like, we have to increase salaries. We got to do whatever we have to do to increase them, and we did. And the prior year, we had focused on our hourly employees and our specifically our maintenance employees, and did some pretty sizable salary adjustments for them. Out of the whole budget, it didn't cost a lot, but it sure helped us in keeping those employees. But now we're dealing with things have changed, and even our students that are dropping now, we're really looking at that data, because before it was focused around finances and childcare. And now, this fall, most of our students have dropped because of illness. So we're seeing things that it's just very different, and it's a time that we really, what we do to help our students with their needs, we have to really look at what their real needs are now.
Well,
Yeah.
we've had to invest in specific areas of our employee population that that it's even more competitive than what it once was before. And we could all talk about, nursing faculty and that sort of thing. But even with, we have a very large police force, a sworn police force, that, there's a pipeline problem, first of all, people going into the profession, but the competitive nature of those roles in our area, that we're undergoing a comprehensive compensation review for all of our roles. But we started with our law enforcement, that ultimately we made the decision to increase our starting salary for our law enforcement folks by $17,000. That's how much we increased it. And we wanted to stay competitive. We could have gone a little bit lower, but we didn't want to nickel and dime and be back and forth in this conversation. But, that was a big swing and a big investment, but one that's necessary because safety kind of matters to everything that we do.
Well, I think the hard part about this conversation is that we've increased our investment in our employees, but it comes at a cost, and we could have a whole nother panel just on what did we eliminate in order to add to, and we don't talk about that enough, and we're not going to talk about it here either. So, Terry, how did you invest in your employees? And then I'm going to let you give us a framework for process.
Okay. So we're a bit unusual in that we, our employees don't all receive the same percentage raise. We actually give performance reviews and their raises based on that, and there's 4 levels. But I believe the last year, if you averaged them, the average was about 5%. And so that was quite generous, and we did a little chart to show them over the last 6-8 years what the inflation rate has added to, because they all thought they should get 8% because that was inflation, but all these other years it was 0.1%, and we gave you a 3% raise, so we kind of demonstrated why that was a suitable raise. But more than that, I'm the accountant, so I'm not the touchy-feely one, but we, wafting over into HR side of the house, there became a real hunger for remote work. There became a hunger for a lot of things that we hadn't been that open to before. And so we're starting, we now have a procedure if your job allows it. Obviously, police can't do it, facilities personnel cannot do it, but if with your leader's approval, you can work up to 2 days remotely. So trying to do other things to retain people that's not always just money driven. And we're starting to put a lot of focus on wellness and different amenities for our employees that maybe we thought were just kind of niceties, and now we're seeing them as more important. And reminding them, we kind of stepped back from professional development conferences and things during the pandemic, and trying to fund that in a robust manner so that it's not, all the emphasis is not on salary.
Yes.
Okay, so I've been having conversations with people in community college spaces and four-year college spaces about the fact that there's been this shift to remote, and it seems like there won't be a shift to back in the offices, and that there has been some cost-benefit analysis being done, and there seems to be a little surge in some funds available now because spaces, like you said, that you guys thought about purchasing or renting buildings and things of that nature, you're no longer. So have you guys noticed that? Are those conversations still happening? And do you all foresee that happening long-term in some positions staying remote so that you can actually see that bottom line savings long-term?
Well, so we rolled out a new FlexWork program this fall, and it wasn't necessarily focused on savings or any of that, but there was, the retention efforts that were a part of it. But we were very clear as we rolled it out. Not every function would be eligible, and not every role would be eligible, and not every individual necessarily can function in that remote sort of capacity. The voters supported a $1.1 billion bond initiative for us in 2019. And so, we continue to evaluate and look at the implementation of that bond initiative, of what does space utilization need to look like differently, because maybe there are some roles that we had planned might be in this area that they're functioning differently in the new FlexWork policy. So yeah, we're certainly paying attention to them.
I think there could be an entire panel discussion on what our space utilization is going to look like in the next 2 decades. And we've invested in buildings that we may need to figure out how to sell, right? And I think we're in the very beginning of trying to figure out what that looks like. We can talk about process. We all have the forms, like when I came to Amarillo College, they were called the PET forms. What are the forms that you have that what are the nicknames your institutions have for your budget forms? Any? Okay, just Amarillo College has little nicknames for their budget forms. There's a process that we all go through. I don't think the process itself is magical as long as everyone knows what that process is. But in that process, there's got to be an analysis on return on investment. And I want my colleagues to talk about how they frame that ROI. And I'll give you an example, like Pam talked about illness for students. We've noticed the same thing. And so we've taken the unusual step of not just investing in additional mental health resources, but physical health, and allowing our students' dependents to have access to that medical care, because our students were dropping out not just because of their illness, but because of their family illness. So for us, we were able to use CARES funds. We're testing that to see if it would have a return on retention investment for college budget implications moving forward. Do you all have an ROI framework or process that you look at?
I can give you one example, and it kind of works for multiple things. We were kind of at the forefront a few years ago of moving to open resource books and online books in an attempt to save our students money, which, since we are outsourced to Barnes & Noble, when we get a commission, obviously hits us in the pocket on the
Yeah.
auxiliary side. But more than saving our students money, that's nice. But what it did was put the books in their hands,
Yeah.
and more than being costly, it was the absence of them having the materials that was important. And so how do you measure that, right? You measure that in they don't drop out. You measure that in they pass the course. That's an ROI for me. And something, the next thing we find that costs us money, we'll do that too, because it's the right thing to do for the students. And so I think when we try and talk about ROI at San Jack, it's always about what's the best thing for the student. And I think everyone will say the
Well,
same.
I think that's a framework that we've not used as effectively as we could as a sector. Sometimes we haven't historically done things that are the right things to do for students and missing the boat in the process. Investing in students actually might have an ROI in retention and learning and skill building and enrollment. Do you all have an ROI framework?
Yeah, I mean, very, very similar, and I'll use that example. We launched our Include Ed textbooks program in 2019. So $79 a credit hour, all of your learning materials are included in day one. That saves students an estimated $27 million a year, so that's great, right? But it was them being better prepared on day one. And so I've tried not to throw out big numbers here because of the scope and scale, but I'll use this as an example very quickly.
Pam and I'll try not to be jealous.
Okay, no, but I'll use this example. We have 30,000 dual credit students that are part of Dallas College, and it's an investment that we have made and grown dual credit by 133% over the last 6 or 7 years, and because we have resources, we make the investment to waive dual credit costs. That's about $31 million a year that we are investing in those students. And so the story that I tell about ROI related to that is that, we heard the commissioner talk earlier about P-TECHs, and we have the largest number of P-TECHs in the Dallas area, anywhere in the country. And one of those industry partners is American Airlines, and our partnership with DISD. The short version of the story is that American Airlines hired that first cohort of students. So they're 18 years old, they're graduating high school, they've got a degree from us, debt-free, with a credential of value in the marketplace, and American hired that first cohort of students for $58,000 a year,
Yeah.
which is amazing. the average family household income that those students come from is $28,000. So that's what all of our institutions are doing, how we impact generational poverty in different ways, different levels, different scales. And so I think ultimately that's the ROI that matters.
So I will conclude, and I'll ask my colleagues to take 30 seconds each to give us the one piece of advice you would give a new regent to go home with. But I think what our concern is, I mean, I loved this comic because I think it captures what happens so often in higher ed. We're not going to take risks, and as a result, we're killing ourselves, but we're being fiscally responsible in doing so. What's one quick advice you would have for any new regent to take home with them?
I think don't be scared to let your administration, trust your administration. Don't be scared to let them try new things. They may not sound exactly how you would direct the budget, but they know your students and they have the heart for your students that wouldn't be in this work. So.
Yeah, I think the short version always is students first. That's why we all come into this line of work. We shared with our board at the board meeting this week. Was that yesterday? Yesterday, our board meeting. A student that came to one of our campuses in 1996, took one course, has passed away, and now has left about $1 million to support single parents. And so I think that in 1996, in that one course, we didn't have any idea of the impact that we were having on that student. But hopefully the investment that we made in her is what led and garnered to her supporting us much later on.
I think learn your budget process that at your institution, and then look at the data as it comes to you, because you're going to be provided with data during the year that will really help you make those decisions and understand what's happening at the college.
That's really good. I would say my advice is to ask the question you're afraid to ask. Because if you have the question as a new regent, I can guarantee you that your other colleagues do as well, and there's a historical avoidance of asking those questions. And the second piece of advice that I would encourage you to do is to reach out to these three amazing souls. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. I know these colleagues will be available for questions if you want them, but thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Terry, for organizing this. Appreciate it. Yeah, you as well.
One of my peers at